Staan. 35 zetels. De grootste partij van Nederland.
Geert Wilders is celebrating his win after the Dutch parliamentary elections, and the Dutch woke up to a new political reality on the morning of the 23rd of November. Hello and welcome to Euroscepticism's Beyond the Byline podcast. I am Evie Chiori, and in this episode we are focusing on the result of the Dutch elections and the rise of the far right in the European Union. Geert Wilders, the anti-Islam populist, secured a significant victory in Dutch elections, signaling a notable shift to the far right in a country once celebrated for its tolerance. Geert Wilders is now positioned to lead talks for the next governing coalition, potentially becoming the first far-right Prime Minister of the Netherlands, as his Party for Freedom secured 37 seats in the 150-seat lower house of Parliament, more than double his previous tally of 17 in the last elections. This outcome is sending shockwaves through Europe, where far-right ideologies are gaining momentum, since this isn't the only victory for the far-right in the EU. So what have been the reactions so far, and what does this result mean for the Netherlands?
The first reaction was shock, because even though we've sadly become used to this kind of rather bad news, Geert Wilders did much better than actually the polls had anticipated. So the last Ipsos poll that came out on the 21st put him on 27 seats, whereas in fact he's come out, at least so far, with 37 seats.
Catherine Fieschi is a comparative political analyst with a focus on populism, authoritarianism, and challenges to democracy and representation, and she's currently a fellow at the Robert Schuman Centre, an interdisciplinary research centre at the heart of the European University Institute.
So I think that the first thing that I note was shock. The second reaction, I think, was, as is often the case, and obviously particularly right now, that this is a really unfortunate development, because we need a particularly united Europe at the moment to face a number of huge challenges. And this, signals probably more disunity, and it also sends a pretty dire signal for the potential results of the European parliamentary elections, which are going to be held in June of 2024. So all in all, it's a kind of a big amalgam of shock, disappointment, and a little bit of dread about what this means for the future.
So what can they expect? What implications does this outcome hold for the country?
He hasn't formed a government yet. So I think, in a sense, I'd like to cling to that last hope. We know that the left alliance, the Timmermans alliance, will not cooperate with him. But on the other hand, we know that the other, two major parties, the Liberals and the right, have made noises that, they haven't excluded really the possibility of working with Wilders. So I think that, the next few days and weeks are going to be crucial. One of the things it means for the country is, given the difficulty, A, that they're going to face in forming a coalition, and B, in keeping it together, the Netherlands is looking at, more instability and probably more weak government, and therefore even more exasperated voters.
Is the emergence of far-right governments in Europe and the EU becoming a discernible trend?
Yes, it is becoming a trend, and it's been a trend for a long time. This is not the first time that Geert Wilders does well. It's quite clear that really, if you look at the party that has most support in France right now, it is Marine Le Pen's party. If you take the Polish elections, over which we breathed a sigh of relief, the fact is that PIS is still the party with the most support. Of course, we have to think of Orban. There are very few good news stories. Spain is one of them. Mm-hmm. I really want to mention the good news stories when I can. But the fact is that, yes, we are witnessing a trend.
So, what factors contribute to the growing trend of Europeans turning to and voting for the far right?
It's a complicated and multifaceted question. I would say that, in the case of the Netherlands, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that this was also a vote, both of, I would call it fatigue and also exasperation. There is that was playing out in the Netherlands. This was the fourth Rutte government. He'd been in power for a long time. The last coalition took 12 months to negotiate and only managed to hold for 18 months. And the coalition fell because they failed to find an agreement, and quite tellingly, on asylum policy. So, in a sense, you could argue that this kind of behavior is precisely the kind of irritation, exasperation, and exhaustion that populist parties do very well on, because the mainstream look incompetent. They look like they're really busy only looking out for themselves rather than for the country. So, I would say that there's something particular to this election in the Netherlands. But the other thing that I think we need to keep in mind, of course, is the weaponization of immigration, which obviously is used by people like Wilders. But I would say, I think, two things are important to keep in mind with respect to this election, because they give us, I think, broader clues, for what else is going on. The first is that one of the things that Rutte did was essentially move right on immigration and asylum issues. One of the reasons that his coalition split up was he wanted to toughen the asylum policy. And, time and again, parties of the center or center-right play this game. And what they end up doing is they do the work for the populist right or even the far right. And at election time, they don't collect on it, but the populists and the far right often do. So, I think there's a cautionary tale here. That kind of tactic only very, very seldom works for mainstream parties. It worked in Sweden a few years ago, but I think this is really an important thing. The other part that I think explains a little bit why people are voting for these parties is that if we look at how Wilders played his campaign, what we note is that he was certainly, no friend of Islam throughout it, but actually he toned down his rhetoric in comparison to the way that he'd previously spoken over the past 15 years. There was a lot less, what I would call Islam bashing than there was in the past. What he did was adopt what I would call the Marine Le Pen playbook, right? He went on social issues. He courted working class voters. He started talking about health. He's talking about old age. He started talking about housing. And I think that, we need to understand the fact that these parties, because they've been on our radar for a while, we tend to sort of interpret them always in the same way. But actually, they have changed pretty fundamentally. I mean, they're certainly no friend of migrants or asylum seekers or minorities. But what they've done is that they have started to play a much more clever game, capitalizing on disaffected working class voters who usually would have voted for the left, but now tend to feel that they've been let down or abandoned and are voting for them. And Wilders played exactly this for this campaign.
And would you say that the far-right parties are now adding and adopting a broader scope of topics that interest the public, and they include them in their pro-electoral campaigns as well?
Yes, and I think that it's not so much that they're so much more interested in these topics, but they're actually adopting an electoral strategy based on the data that they have, and they know that that voters are going to be much more receptive in a time of anxiety and change and inflation and rising inequality, that they're going to be incredibly receptive, to a more social agenda, and potentially a little less receptive to a diehard Eurosceptic agenda.
And speaking of Euroscepticism, in the previous episode of our podcast about what to expect from these Dutch elections, Professor of Politics at the University of Amsterdam, Sarah de Lang, mentioned that the Netherlands is shifting towards a more Eurosceptic trajectory.
Many of the right-wing leaning parties have a more Eurosceptic position than the previous government. And many of the measures that they would like to take against the influx of immigrants is not really possible within the existing EU legislative frameworks.
Catherine, what is your take on this? What would you add, and what are the reasons leading to more Euroscepticism?
These parties remain very much Eurosceptic, but they have learned that their voters don't necessarily want them to pull out of Europe. What their voters want and what these parties pursue is a different kind of Europe from the inside, right? And to change it from the inside. For example, nobody is really talking about pulling out of the euro anymore. Marine Le Pen tried that in 2017 and it was a catastrophe, right? And so they've all learned, from her playbook and have become critical of Europe, but they want to stay in and not pull out. It's a form of Euroscepticism because they contest the legitimacy of these institutions. They don't want the European institutions to meddle inside national and domestic politics. So yes, this is a Eurosceptic trend. I think we need to take two things into account. One is that the Netherlands, in some ways, even under Rutte, had a particular view of how Europe should work. And in many ways, it was already at odds with, some of what the Commission was doing, and certainly at odds with, some of the more federalist-minded, members, right? The Netherlands were already, labeled as part of the frugal group, perhaps even leading the frugal group, had in a sense, quite a critical stance, against the kind of protectionist regulation and view of industrial policy that Europe was putting forward. So in any case, we're starting from a place where I think, there's a very liberal, mercantilist, and in a sense, kind of a more restricted view of what Europe should be involved in. What we're looking at with Wilders is this, much more in spades, with an emphasis on the kind of fortress Europe mentality, of course, in terms of borders, a real emphasis on borders, in contrast to a more liberal view. So I think that, it's important to see this as a general trend, but also to see some of the particularities of the Netherlands when we talk about relationship to Europe and Euroscepticism.
Right. So how do you expect this result to impact and influence the country's international relations with others, and specifically with the EU?
In this very particular moment, and given the pressures created by the Russian war against Ukraine, this is going to have a negative impact, particularly on that. We're talking about a party, Wilders' party, that questions sending more arms to Ukraine, that is not at all on board with the accession process. So in terms of Europe and also Europe's capacity to act together and to act externally and to weigh in as a constructive foreign policy actor, if Wilders manages to form a government, this is bad news in terms of slowing Europe down even more on that. I think that, it also will create the kind of, in a sense, non-cooperative attitude across the board, particularly on trade and commerce. Although it's not quite clear how Wilders would conduct himself on industrial policy. And then, of course, there's the immigration issue, right? Where here we're faced with a Europe where we have, Meloni in one place, Orban in another, and then, potentially now Wilders in the Netherlands. This spells out an even further hardening the European capacity to handle migration. And I think that too is hugely problematic, given the fact that it is an incredibly important and urgent topic to manage in the current moment, and it's not going to get any less urgent in the next few years. So I think that these are some of the key issues on which citizens want Europe to act. On climate, which we know he is not going to support, the kind of environmental policies that the Commission and that Europe has been, pretty good at pushing. On migration, there's going to be lack of cooperation as well. So this puts a spanner, in the wheels of Europe and of the European Union, for sure.
Thank you very much. I am Evi Kiori, and this was Euractiv's Beyond the Byline podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up to our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you can do so on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever it is that you're listening to your podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time. Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.